One of the first decisions that we made with this project was to create this very thin payment gateway interface, and that allowed us to create this fake payment gateway implementation, which we've been using so far as we focus on driving out our application logic, so we haven't needed to worry about talking to Stripe. Now that we've got a lot of the important application logic out of the way, I wanted to switch our focus to trying to build out an implementation of our payment gateway that does actually talk to Stripe. Now there's a couple different approaches you can take when testing these sorts of classes that integrate with third-party services, but I'm going to show you the approach that I like, and we'll contrast that with some alternatives in a future lesson. So to get started, we're going to create a new test in our unit billing folder called Stripe Payment Gateway Test. And we'll scaffold out a new test case here, and we'll call it Stripe Payment Gateway Test. And we got to figure out what the very first test we want to write is. So if you remember back when we were testing our fake payment gateway, we wrote this test that tested that charges with a valid payment token were successful. I think that's a reasonable place to start with our actual Stripe-based implementation as well. So let's add a new test here, and we'll call it charges with a valid payment token are successful. So let's start sort of sketching out what we need this test to do with some comments. So the first thing that we're going to need to do for our arrange step is to create a new Stripe payment gateway instance. Then for our act step, we're going to want to create a new charge for some amount using a valid token. And finally, for our assert phase, we're going to want to verify that the charge was completed successfully. So let's start fleshing out these comments with some actual code. So this first step is going to be pretty straightforward. We can do something like payment gateway equals new Stripe payment gateway. And this may take a dependency or two, but let's not worry about it yet. And now to create a new charge, we're going to want to call the charge method, which is defined in our payment gateway interface here. So we're going to want to do something like payment gateway charge, and we'll pass through some known amount. So maybe we'll do $25 since that's what we did in the fake payment gateway test. But then we also need to pass through some valid token, right? And this is where things get a little bit tricky. What are we going to determine as a valid payment token, and where are we going to get a valid payment token from? You might remember in the fake payment gateway, we just had a hard-coded valid token that we were using here. And because this is a fake implementation that didn't actually talk to any external services, this didn't really matter. But when it comes to this situation here, where we're trying to test the actual Stripe-based implementation, we have an important decision to make. Do we want to somehow get a real valid token that the Stripe API is actually going to consider a valid token? Or do we want to use a test double or some sort of way of mocking this out or faking this out so that we can just create some sort of hard-coded valid token somewhere in our test? In my opinion, this Stripe Payment Gateway class represents our integration with Stripe. The whole goal of this class is to take the interface that we designed previously and provide an implementation that successfully communicates with Stripe in the way that we expect. So personally, I would prefer to use a real Stripe token that Stripe actually considers valid, and not something mocked out or stubbed. So how can we get a valid token from Stripe that it's going to accept as a valid token when we try to make some charge? Well, to figure this out, we're going to need to learn a little bit more about how Stripe's API works, as well as how their official PHP library works. So the first thing I did here is I created a test account with Stripe. You can see I created this TicketBeast demo test account, and we can use this account in our tests to actually make charges to Stripe and verify that things are working as expected. So because I've created this test account, if we head over to Stripe's API reference, you can see that it's automatically providing our test keys in the documentation, which makes it easy for us to copy and paste some of these examples and test things out. So you can see here I'm already looking at the create a card token section of the API documentation. This is where it shows us how to create a valid token from some sort of test card that we can use to make a charge to Stripe. So the way that it works is you call the create method on Stripe's token class and just pass through information about a fake test card. In this case, this is the sort of traditional Stripe test card where it's just 4242, 4242, 4242, 4242. And as long as you pass through some date that's in the future and any CVC code, this will give you back a valid token. So we can use this code in our test to create a valid payment token that we can then use to make a test charge to Stripe. So in order to use this library in our tests, of course we're going to have to require it in via Composer. So let's head over to our terminal and require this library. We can say composer require stripe/stripe-php, and this should pull in this library for us. Okay, great. So it looks like we've pulled in that package successfully. So let's copy this code and paste it into our test and kind of play with it a little bit and kind of get a feel for how it's meant to work. So if we head back to Sublime Text here, I'm just going to paste that code in between where we instantiated the gateway and where we're doing the charging. And I'm going to clean this up a little bit. We'll use a modern PHP array syntax instead of this kind of old school PHP 5.3 array syntax. And I want to think about this expiry month and expiry year a little bit. Right now, this is a date in the future. It's currently December 2016. So December 2017 is a date in the future, and this will continue to work. But in January 2018, this test would start to fail. So we don't want to hard code this information here. We want to use some sort of dynamic value. So we can guarantee that we're always getting a year in the future by getting the current year using PHP's date function and then adding 1 to it. So this will give us 2017 now that we're in 2016, and next year this will return 2018, and it'll always stay a little bit ahead, which is nice. Now, since the year is always going to be in the future, it doesn't really matter what the month is, but I don't really like having 12 here because it's sort of specific. Like, why is it 12? It seems like it was put there intentionally. I would rather just make that 1 because then it's sort of more clear that it's just test data. Now, similarly for the CVC, 314 again looks like some sort of specific intentional value. I'd rather change this to something silly like just 123 that makes it a little bit more obvious that it's just test data. So I'm going to quickly reformat this code a little bit because right now it's got 2 spaces of indentation and we want 4. And I think what I'd like to do is just kind of capture the result of this into this token variable, comment out this code down here since it's invalid, and just kind of dump this out and see what it sort of gives us. So if we just do a dd token and run this test, we can see what we're getting back. So it looks like we're getting back this big structure here that contains a ton of information, but what we want here is this ID field, because that's the actual token that we actually want to pass through. So if you go back and look at the documentation, you can see that more clearly here. Here's the structure that we're getting back, and here's the actual token itself, which is stored in the ID field. So the token that we want to keep, that we want to pass through as the valid token, is going to be the ID field that comes back from this token object. So let's just dump that out and run this again and see that we're just getting a single string. Okay, so now we're just getting back a token, and this should be a valid token since we did use a valid test card. I'd like to make a couple other tweaks here. Right now we're just setting my personal secret key here just hard-coded in the test. This is probably not the right way to do it because this is going to get committed to the repository, and different members on the team are all going to have their own keys for their own test Stripe accounts. So the better way to handle this is by putting this into our environment file. So I actually have this set up in my .env file already underneath Stripe secret and Stripe key. And now if you head over to config services.php, you can see this is already referenced by default out of the box with a new Laravel installation because Cashier also uses Stripe. So this is already set up for you. So we can access any of this stuff by using the config helper. So instead of having to hard code this, we can actually set the API key using config services.stripe.secret. And now if multiple people are working on the same project, they can all have their own key. The other tweak I'd like to make is instead of setting the API key globally here, you can also set this API key on a per request basis, which makes it a little bit nicer because you're not dealing with global state. I'll show you what I'm talking about. If you head over to the Stripe API documentation, up in the authentication section, you can see that there's 2 ways to authenticate. So you can either set the API key globally, or you can pass the second configuration array to any call and pass through the API key explicitly, and it'll use that API key just for that one request. So instead of setting it globally, let's go ahead and add that second array here that takes the API key field, and the API key is going to be this call up here, this config services.stripe.secret. And now we can get rid of this call here that sets it globally. So to verify that this is still working, let's just run this again and make sure that we're still getting something back that looks like a token. And we are, so it looks like everything is working the way we expect. So let's head back to the test and uncomment some of this stuff. So we'll bring back this first line where we're creating this Stripe payment gateway. And now here where we're doing the charging, we can actually pass this token through now that we actually have a token that we are considering to be a valid token. So let's get rid of this dump here. And now we have to think about how are we going to verify that the charge was completed successfully. See if you can figure out how we might do that, and I'll show you my approach in the next lesson.